Welcome to all participants of the Industry Transition Day, and in particular to the panel called the Green Mile, Moving Towards Green Mobility. My name is Christoph Wolf, and I'm leading the initiatives of the World Economic Forum that we call Mobility Industries. This includes all modes that move people and goods at global scale, in cities or rural areas across continent or in the last mile. Industry transition is one of our core themes. We are working with many industry partners, governments, cities, and civil society towards global mobility systems that are more safe, clean, and inclusive. Shipping, aviation, and heavy transport are in our focus, as they play crucial roles at global scale. Shipping moves 90% of global trade. Trucks, in addition to rail, move cargo to shops and increasingly to homes. And aviation connects the world, even though that is taking somewhat of a pause in these COVID days. They are called the hard-to-abate sectors, as decarbonization is harder because they cover long distance and carry huge weights. Batteries here come to a limit. They need to zero carbon drop-in fuel base that is not fossil, but can match fossil fuels in energy intensity. These three sectors have in common that they are thought to be last in the overall transition to net zero. Therefore, I'm glad we could win some of our core forum partners to join us today on this Industry Transition Day. We want to discuss that maybe hard-to-abate may no longer be the best label for this industry, as a lot of innovation and entrepreneurialism, together with increasing focus by regulators, has come into these sectors over the last couple of years, and solutions are underway. With that, I would like to give the floor to Tian Wei, who will lead us through a conversation that surely will be lively and engaging. Ms. Tian Wei is a host of World Insight on China Global Television Network. She's a young global leader of the forum, a media leader, and a member of the Global Future Council on China. Over to you, Tian Wei.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Thank you for setting the stage for this wonderful discussion to come. And it's a great pleasure to be the moderator for the next hour of event. May I ask our participants all over the world to take a look at a poll we have prepared for you. In fact, we prepared for you two polls. One is at the very beginning of the event. The other is after our discussion. We'll check again about your opinions. Look at this poll you could have from Slido. What is the industry that can achieve the greatest progress by 2030, whether it's shipping, heavy transport, or trucking, or aviation? You can choose what you think is likely to be the biggest change are. Wow, we are seeing some great results coming out. Changing by the second, it seems, the result. Let's see. Okay, for now, we are seeing trucking, as we have seen, 54%. Changing also. So let's see, for now, it is shipping, 39%. Okay, it seems that we are having some stable numbers now. Shipping 40%, aviation 18%, and trucking 39%, but I'm sure that will change as our discussion goes. We'll see how things are after our round of discussion. Thank you for everybody's participating. This is going to be an interesting result to check later. So let's go to our panel discussion for today, the Clean Mile, moving towards green mobility. As you may know, the aviation, shipping, and trucking sectors jointly account for almost 14% of all global CO2 emissions, a percentage that could be more than double by the year 2015 if no action is taken. And other sectors decarbonize. So with mobility of the people and goods expected to increase in the coming decades, of course, at this moment, a lot of uncertainties as a result of COVID-19, these hard-to-abate mobility sectors will need to find approaches to significantly reduce their emissions. So in our session today, we're going to have real people in the know to figure out what are still the challenges to achieve the goal and what could be some of the great solutions. So let me have the pleasure to introduce the 4 panelists with us. First of all, Dick Benshaw, who is the president and CEO of Royal Schiphol Group. Dick, good to see you. Hello. And we also have Michael Parker, who is the chairman of the Global Shipping and Logistics with the Citigroup Global Capital Markets. Michael, good to see you.
Good morning, good evening.
Good morning and good evening to you. And also Catherine Dixon, who's the vice president with the Strategy Carbon Architecture with Shell. Catherine? Hi, good to see you. We are also expecting another panelist, Arthur Patterson, to join us. I'm sure she will be with us a bit later. Thank you so much. Let me begin by throwing out this important question. What are the opportunities for the aviation sector over the coming decade and beyond to achieve net zero by 2050, or probably even sooner? Dick.
John Wei, thank you very much. And Christoph and the West, thank you for inviting me and all of you to participate. As the poll shows, there's some work to do for the aviation sector, and we are acutely aware of it. It starts with ambition, of course. And then the aviation sector has had a bit of an issue because it had the benefit of being very early through ICAO, which is a UN organization, almost a decade ago already, for setting targets for carbon abatement in aviation, moving towards 2050. After that, Paris, of course, happened, and the whole target setting became more strict towards 2 degrees, on our way to 1.5 degrees, if that is possible. And the aviation industry has been, so to say, catching up with that new target and the Paris target. I think it's very important that we do align on the net zero by 2050 target, which is the result of the Paris agreement. And I hope that the ICAO UN organization and the member states will be able to do that coming up to their new General Assembly in 2022 as well. It would not be sustainable, so to say, for a sector to have a kind of a separate table and separate targets to discuss your contribution to the big challenge of climate change. We all have to be at the same table within the same framework. And you see many players now in the aviation industry, whether it's airlines or airports, committing to the net zero target. At Schiphol, Amsterdam, other airports, we have done that as well. And for our own operations, we have gone further because we have said at the airport, which is not the most difficult part, but at the airport, we want to be net zero by 2030. And we want to contribute to overall decarbonization of aviation. The contribution of aviation to climate change is still relative at the moment. It's around 3% of emissions, but it will be rising, and also in relative terms. So we have to take care of it and take action now. We want to preserve the benefits of aviation. Aviation is kind of the nerve system of the world economy. We cannot and we will not do without aviation, but we will have to do without carbon and as fast as possible. I think there's 4 approaches, 4 interventions we have to take. The one is efficiency, as in every sector, which has to do with fleet renewal, air traffic management, becoming more efficient. Actually, that one is working relatively well. The aviation sector has become more efficient already over the past 10 or 20 years than the economy as a whole. It's around 2% or 2+% efficiency gains. So what can we do to further improve on that and keep that going? So efficiency, that's one. The second one, and that's really the one which has to happen now, is around the introduction of sustainable aviation fuels. Whether it's advanced biokerosene, whether it's synthetic fuels, they have to be developed now. And that is the way forward for the aviation sector. And if you think about 2030 targets and what's the biggest contribution going to be, it is around those sustainable aviation fuels. And we see a push there. We see American airlines moving into it. We see big developments in Europe. We see India very interested. And it is getting the incentives, the regulation, solving the chicken and egg problem, getting supply and demand organized. That's the name of the game there. And I think specific mandates could be put in place to take care of that. The third push we have to do is on research and development into the next time frame. And we can think about hybrid flying, electric flying, use of hydrogen. That's all still in various stages of development, but that should be pushed as well, because that will start to contribute towards 2050 to sustainable aviation as well. And the fourth intervention, and that's where everyone can contribute, whether it's everyone who is flying corporately or privately, that's around compensation. So as long as we emit, even when we are getting more efficient, when we introduce sustainable fuels, we have to compensate. And that is something everybody has to be aware of, I believe. That's not a long-term solution, but it will help. Finally, COVID-19 means something, of course. In my work, it has created a lot of focus, and aviation is and tourism is one of the hardest hit sectors. What it does mean as well, that we have to be very sharp on the investments and the policies we put in place. And that would be my plea to policymakers as well, because there's a lot of policies going around, like putting ticket taxes in place, which yes, increase the cost of aviation, but do not do the job of greening aviation. In a world where we have to be very precise now around the investments we make and the costs we are going to add, we have to be really sharp around the policies. As a sector, I think we are coming together, not just in the formal bodies, but also in engagements like Clean Skies for Tomorrow, which is a coalition led by the WEF, where all type of players come together to drive the ambition and to drive the push, which I think is quite clear to do. But there's the interplay between the policy and the investment still has to improve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dick, for helping us to understand for the aviation industry these days, particularly at the time of COVID-19, how to look at the longer term of dealing with the carbon issue, particularly with a great goal for 2050. Thank you. And let's have Asa Patterson. She is joining us right now. Asa is the head of public affairs and sustainability with Scania. Asa, good to see you.
Hello, good to see you too.
Good to see you. My question for you is about, of course, the road transport sector over the coming decade and beyond, about achieving net zero by 2050, and once again, probably even sooner. Your thought?
Yes, thank you very much. And I like that, probably even sooner, because of course, we need to be at net zero by 2050, in line with the Paris Agreement. That's, of course, a necessary path for the transport sector and the trucking sector to take. It was very interesting with this poll here. I'm not sure whether trucking or aviation is leading on taking the biggest change, but we'll see who gets there first. Probably we will get there first, because our small advantage here, if it's to be called an advantage, is that we are actually in the starting blocks of electrifying, and it's definitely possible to electrify heavy duty transport. Very much similar to Dick's possibilities and challenges, the transport sector and heavy duty trucking is standing in the position where we have a necessary service to society that we're providing, and demand is rising. So right now, heavy duty transport is standing for around 7% of the global CO2 emissions, but rising because demand is rising. And that's an interesting effect of the crisis that we're in right now, of course, that people are actually buying more and more goods and services and having things delivered to home and online, where we see then a rising demand of transport. And of course, that was the crisis again, was really illustrating that transport is the bloodstream of society, when we, in the beginning of this crisis, were making sure to really keep all transports running and open to get medical equipment and food still being delivered all over the world. So our customers were really the heroes in that situations. But nevertheless, of course, we need to then transform because of this rising demand. And it starts with efficiency, just like Dick was talking about for aviation. And this has for long been the truck makers' large competition. I mean, we're competing on efficiency. So whoever has the most efficient engine is actually what the customer wants, because then you will consume less fuel, which is good for your own wallet, but of course also decreases CO2 emissions. But we've also known since long that this alone will not reach a net zero target, of course, by 2050. There is also another level of efficiency. It's on the whole system, where the transport system today has a huge opportunity in better planning, actually. So from a systems perspective, there are huge efficiencies to be gained, both on optimizing routes and also on filling rates. In Europe, in average today, a truck is filled by 60%. So there is a huge waste there, 40%, that can be taken away by planning the system better, which actually digitalization and connectivity is a lever to help us with. But we can also work already today on the rolling fleets with sustainable fuels for trucks. And there are different options available. You can work with biofuels. You can also work with synthetic fuels that are not so much available. And in Sweden, where I come from and where I am right now, we have a very long success story with working with biofuels in our heavy-duty transport sector, where today around 20% of the fuel consumed is a sustainable biofuel. But of course, the situation looks different in different parts of the world. And another possibility here is to work with gas and biogas, which can be produced from basically any waste system in any country, and is an asset that every country is sitting on. So here are things that can be done already now using the rolling fleet or with a small investment in your truck. But of course, the shift that we're seeing is towards electrification. And that is the important step that our sector is coming into right now. Because once you start electrifying, electricity will be a cheaper way of running the whole transport system. So you will then move away slowly from conventional fuels and even internal combustion engines over time. So, but here, of course, what needs to be unlocked is the infrastructure investments, because even if now more and more manufacturers are presenting their first battery electric vehicles coming out for sales, Scania, for example, announced just this spring that we have sold 75 battery electric vehicles to a Norwegian customer, ASKO, that will be put out during this year on the market, and there are of course many more to come, but infrastructure is needed, and it's actually quite illustrating because there is no infrastructure is available to today charge a heavy duty vehicle anywhere. So there is a major rollout of infrastructure that needs to be closely planned together with policymakers and society. And that's another important thing to underline. Of course, no one can do this alone. We need to work together in partnerships, both with society and policymakers, but also throughout the value chain. And Scania has started very valuable partnerships, trying to work like this along the value chain, where we're working together with H&M, who then represents a large transport buyer that can place demands into the transport market, and ourselves then as a vehicle manufacturer. And E.ON, who is an energy company, both distributing electricity and producing electricity. And then we have Siemens in the partnership, who represent infrastructure development and provider of infrastructure. And also Ericsson has recently joined this partnership, illustrating the potential of connectivity and digitalization, as I was talking about, on the more system efficiency level of the transport system. So together, the 5 companies of us, we work together, try to find opportunities, both where we can improve things ourselves, learning from each other, but also then discussing directly with policymakers on how to remove the hurdles of getting to a sustainable transport system in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asa. It's great to see everybody's in a competition mode in terms of when to achieve and with how to achieve the tools. So it's going to be a great morning, I guess, we're going to have today. Let me just remind everyone who are participating in our discussion, please do activate your participation in the session by using the interactive platform Slido to take part in live polls and also share your questions. You can actually share a question right now. Go there, and also you can scan the QR code, which will provide you with a shortcut into the system. We're looking forward to some of your questions, because later after this round of discussion with our panelists, they're also there to answer your questions. Now, let me come back to the panelists. Our first speaker, Michael Parker, who is the chairman of the Global Shipping and Logistics with Citigroup Global Capital Markets. So earlier we've been hearing from different sectors, and now what about the maritime sector? Michael, you are an expert in that, and even some of your backdrop photos trying to illustrate that. Help us understand better how this maritime sector over the coming decade and beyond to achieve net zero by 2050, or probably even sooner. Michael.
Thank you, Tamweg. And yes, the background I chose because for the maritime sector, this issue is very foggy. There are many people in the maritime sector who would rather stay concealed in the fog and avoid this issue. But as we've seen, we also, as Dick mentioned, the global aviation regulator, the shipping industry benefits from having a global regulator in the form of the International Maritime Organization. And their most recent regulation, which took effect in January this year around low sulfur fuel, is the effect of that was described by the World Health Organization as likely to save 750,000 premature deaths in coastal communities from moving away from the use of high sulfur fuel for shipping. And I think that illustrates, if you like, the environmental and social benefit from this overall move. But whilst COVID has shown that the effect, if you like, of lower activity, it was pointed out by Dr. Tristan Smith, one of the experts in emissions, particularly for the shipping industry, that we need to have another 10 years of this lower emissions each year. The same effect of COVID on emissions has to be repeated every year for the next 10 years in order to reach the targets of the Paris Agreement. And that is a big challenge. Now, within the maritime sector, we have the Getting to Zero Coalition, which is a coalition led by the Global Maritime Forum, on whose board I sit, together with Friends of Ocean Action, and of course the World Economic Forum, our host today, who are playing a large part in that. And our aim is to get zero emission vessels on the water by 2030 in order to meet the targets the IMO has already set for 2050, which isn't net zero. Now, we know that it will become net zero at some point, and so the shipping industry really has to start making some dramatic moves today already. It was interesting, that poll that showed shipping and trucking being more or less the two that the poll feels can achieve this. And I think the two reasons. One is aviation clearly has a challenge around the scale of the alternative propulsion and fuels. Trucking is more obvious in the sense that everyone can see it on land, and therefore the environmental benefits, as Asa has talked about, of moving to electrification is very visible to people. I think people see shipping as the one that can also move, because the technology exists to do that, whether through hydrogen, through ammonia, through a transition, obviously, to those zero emission fuels. But the technology is there, and it's about the cost, the immense cost of that infrastructure to do that. And the oil companies are playing a large part, I think, through what they've been doing with LNG in helping use the transition to those zero emission fuels to help guide us to what we need to do. But one of the issues the shipping industry faces is a psychology of an industry that prefers to be private, that prefers to look at the ship rather than the supply chain. And so there's a massive change having to take place in the minds of anyone involved in shipping, and concerned about the risks. What are the alternative fuels going to be? The risk of stranded assets, and issues that they've really never had to face before. The regulation issues are also important because the IMO exists to regulate the industry, but as we've seen with the EU, there are regional regulators who also want to get involved here. There has to be some form of agreement, I think, to make that easier for us to achieve those targets. I think one of the key things, and this came out particularly in the Global Maritime Forum Summit we held in Singapore last October, is we need to involve the whole supply chain, and the maritime sector needs to involve all its participants in a concurrent, contiguous, simultaneous set of actions and investments. And for an industry that is used to being investment being sequential, so shipyards will only build when someone does something, or engine manufacturers will wait for someone else to tell them what to do. What we now have, particularly through the Getting to Zero Coalition, is the bringing together of everyone in the ecosystem of the maritime business and also in the supply chain. So what are the key actions? I think clear targets. The IMO is supposed to be coming up with revised targets. Some of those meetings are delayed because of COVID, but we need to see clear targets that everyone in the industry can focus on. We need data transparency. I think that's coming. This is where digitalization and decarbonization are working hand in hand. I think the currency, the real currency for 2020 and certainly 2021 is going to be emissions, CO2 emissions. It's going to become very public. The most important thing, I think, is partnership, represented by a number of people in this panel, but also hopefully in the audience, is partnership between cargo owners, the carriers, as in the shipping industry, and government. We can't do this without government. We need to have global standards. I mentioned the need for regulation to be clear and transparent. We also need to see pilots working, and we have within the maritime sector around 50 to 60 pilots of low emission or zero emission fuels being used and tested, whether it's methanol and other types of fuels. So the industry is doing things which are not yet visible, and hopefully they will become more visible as we in the Getting to Zero Coalition publicize those. I think the other thing is that there are a lot of parallel initiatives which need to take place. So we have to communicate this very widely from all the participants in order to encourage people to believe that A, this is possible and it's achievable, and to get the government to provide the support. We've seen in the UK, the offshore wind sector benefit from underpinning of commercial contracts by government through subsidies, but we've seen a transformation in the mix of energy that the UK uses, and this is also achievable in the industry. To end, what I think we are moving to is a global supply chain effort where the ship is merely part of that, where we go back to the cargo owner being responsible for the emissions, not the ship owner. The ship owner for too long has allowed itself to be taken as the whipping boy, if you like, for global trade. The $18 trillion of global trade that goes by sea is cargo belonging to the manufacturer and being bought by the end consumer. And I think that visibility of data emissions in the supply chain, which part of it, whether it's the maritime sector, the trucking sector, or even the aviation sector, will become much more public. The expression I like to use is from factory floor to front door, that we will be able to measure the emissions and the public will be able to see, the consumer will be able to make the choices they want to make, and then that will dictate how the cargo is carried and what trade routes are used, ultimately what the alternative fuels are. But we have a great challenge. Shipping is focused on 2030 to get the first zero emission vessels, and I think if we can achieve that, then we will get to the net zero in 2050. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oops. My video here. Thank you so much, Michael, I said thank you so much many times when my video gone to you. But for the clarifying from your sector how to look at the general picture, particularly when you say from the floor, factory floor to the front door, about the global supply chain, the changes going on there. I'm sure it's going to be gigantic, but also thought-provoking. We're going to discuss a bit about that later in our interaction. Next, let me go to, last but certainly not least, Catherine Dixon, who is the Vice President of Strategy with Carbon Architecture with Shell. Catherine, earlier your peers have already rallied the crowds by trying to drag more people into voting for them. I want to hear your side. How is an energy company, in fact, like Shell, trying to approach net zero, and how is it working with different sectors to drive this transformation? Catherine.
Great, thank you. Well, I should start by saying we've got an ambition to become a net zero emissions business by 2050 or sooner. But as we look to this future, I think it can be really tempting to look at supply side levers. Are we going to be producing, more, low carbon hydrogen, biofuels? Is it synthetic fuels, or should we be transitioning, wholesale into power, like a company like Ørsted has done? But I think the challenge for Shell is that while what we supply is entirely within our control, this kind of supply side thinking doesn't really help our customers. So currently only about 20% of energy system is electrified. So simply producing more renewable power on its own is not going to help, for example, our shipping customers. And the message that we hear from many of our customers is that they want to reduce their emissions, but in reality they can't. The technology options, might exist in theory, but they don't in practice. Or in other cases, there's little incentive, for the industry on the supply or demand side to invest in the research and development of cleaner technologies. Meanwhile, of course, you've got governments and companies announcing ever more ambitious targets. But targets, really on their own aren't enough. What we really need is to turn these targets into action. And from our perspective, we see the need for action in three areas. The first one is that we need, this sector-based approach, which is great that the WEF's organised this. So we need a demand-side perspective. Simply producing more lower carbon energy on its own isn't enough. Transitions are needed in each of these sectors that we've got here, and each of these sectors poses distinct challenges, as you've heard. Then the second thing that we need is international coordination. So national approaches, have been successful in some sectors. So, in power, for example, you can see, as was just described, you can put in place policies and you don't hurt domestic producers. So, the clean tech scales up, costs come down, and you get this kind of irreversible transition, which we've seen in wind. But in many sectors and the ones that we've heard today, there's international competition, and it's a major constraint. So national governments, are forced to either think, well, do we subsidize the sector, or do we risk it, moving elsewhere? So that's the second thing. And then the third thing, actional sectors, international coordination, we need this systems approach. And I think all of the speakers kind of touched on this. The entire system, the entire value chain needs to invest in the transition together. And that means that we need governments to come together and support industry and to play the coordinating role that only governments really can. So at Shell, we've been doing some deep thinking over the last year across the business, and also with many of our customers to think through what would it take to transition the sectors that we serve to get to net zero. And this has been a huge change in mindset for us. So rather than simply thinking about what services and products the customers want today, we've tried to be much more purposeful in thinking through what the energy transition could mean. So we've been starting with this net Z, NZE mindset, rather than thinking, how can we incrementally, reduce emissions through energy efficiency, et cetera, we're thinking, what would it take to transition the entire system onto something else? What would need to happen, and what role do therefore we want to play, in helping support this system change, but also investing in the transition ourselves. So we've looked at all of the sectors represented here, and in a way, aviation is kind of the easiest because it's the hardest. So, just to unpack that, the decarbonisation pathway is very challenging in aviation, but at least it's directionally clear. We're a large supplier of sustainable aviation fuel now, and we're playing a major role in developing, more production for the industry. And we're considering really carefully, how we accelerate this uptake and production through the 2020s and 2030s. Clearly, in the earlier stages, it's going to be, second-gen biofuels. I think, we know we need to get that working, but getting the volumes there is going to be really difficult in the longer term. So we need to start thinking about syn fuels, and that means opening our minds to kind of reusing, off gases, reusing fossil carbon to make those syn fuels. So we're looking, really in detail at how we can support that sector. In shipping, we're both a big supplier of fuels, but we're also an operator of a large fleet ourselves. So we've got a particular stake. But again, it's a challenging sector. There's no scalable zero carbon drop-in fuel on the horizon. So getting to net zero emissions probably going to need, new drivetrains for ships as well as new fuels. And as you've heard, there's a lot of complexity and inertia in the system, but also no real clear technology pathway. So I think the first focus has to be really to show that something can work and to really get moving on that. And for our part, our bets are on liquid hydrogen, but that will rely on energy efficiency, making that possible, and fuel cell technologies getting to work. And then finally on road freight, there are options for road freight. And clearly, battery electric is going to be, a big route for a lot of the sector. But for heavy duty vehicles and the longer journey for mid-duty vehicles, we do see a role for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles as well. And we think that offers some distinct advantages on range and power and speed. So we're working on that with partners as well. But I guess, across all these sectors, just to come back to where I started, what's really needed is thinking through that coordination challenge and how you get that international coordination between governments to really drive what are, internationally competitive sectors down these pathways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the comprehensive answers. As we speak, we already see questions coming from our participants joining online already. Before we go to those questions, and by the way, do write them in. We're going to have the panelists to answer them a bit later. Before we go to them, I want to go back a little bit to some of the important points all of you, in fact, wonderfully raised in your brief answer. We have seen some, obviously, landscape changes. However, we are also seeing a huge and dramatic justification of value chain, supply chain, and also as a result of that, partnerships, as well as policies. So how do we, at the time of so-called the new normal, this is still a term that needs to be further interpreted. At the time of new normal, how should we plan with this factor in mind, particularly in the next 5 to 10 years? I think that's probably we have to start thinking right now. May I go to every one of you for that, because this is important. And you all talk about the partnerships. And as a result of the change we see, how will you streamline the partnership in order to achieve the goal better? Dick, shall we go to you first, the aviation industry?
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, it's an industry which is hit very hard. For many parts, especially airlines, there will be support available as well. And I think there's the collective challenge to building back better and not just going back to business as usual. I think that is possible. We do not just, and we do that at the airport as well, deal with the current financial crisis we are in, but keep an eye on the long lines, on the targets we have in terms of innovation and sustainability, and keep investing in that within the means we have. But the big question overall, I guess, and that goes for every sector, and especially the ones that are hardest to abate, you have to have a very fine interplay between technology development, between the investments that are needed and the policy and regulation that is required. I think Catherine rightly calls that a coordination issue. Michael talks about the partnerships that are necessary. And I sometimes have the feeling that if we don't do that, if we don't get that right, and therefore give the right incentives, solve the chicken and eggs problems, get investments going, go beyond the level playing issues. That if we don't do that, it sometimes feels like we're not taking the issue seriously enough, because it is a hell of a fight. It is a hell of a challenge. So you have to get it right between every party involved as soon as possible. And there's still struggles there. And that would be my main plea. And I see in the coalitions, I see the industries moving, I see the fuel players, and I see others moving, the OEMs, but especially the interplay on the policy and the regulatory side is not completely there, from carbon pricing to specific mandates. How does it add up? How does it really help? So we still have work to do there.
Let me have also Michael to answer the question, picking up some of the points from earlier from Dick, particularly with the world now. We have seen some real geopolitics and distrust of international mechanism, the partnership that you talk about, global supply chain, all of this depend on the previous two factors. So how do you see that, Michael? And also the grand goal we have in mind, rather.
Well, look, I think we can't avoid the real world outside Zoom conference calls and webinars and things, and the real world is become uncertain through COVID, but also through, global political things. And maybe we have to wait till after November to see where the US, as a very large, important player, comes out on some of these environmental issues. But it seems to me that a focus on a lot of this obviously comes out of, measuring from the Paris Agreement as to what individual sectors and land-based targets are. And I think the next climate change conference, postponed from November this year to Glasgow to next year, is very important, because the world does come together under the auspices of the UN to talk about these issues. What it needs is government, led through the leading nations, if you like, involved in these issues, to acknowledge that climate change is a bigger challenge than COVID-19, and that policy needs to be coordinated. It needs to be competitive in order to produce the innovation that we need to get things done in the time frame. Speaking particularly from the shipping industry's perspective, shipping has subsidized global trade for a very long time. The Economist magazine identified the container box as being the single biggest catalyst to the development and elimination of poverty in the world. And that is what trade does. So when trade falls, so poverty increases. We need to get back to people talking and trading. But at the same time, the people carrying those cargoes cannot lose money in doing it. Otherwise, no one will invest in it. People won't invest in the alternative infrastructure if, in fact, people are going to lose money. For shipping, it means consolidation into bigger companies, but it also means that transparency around emissions means that the shipping industry will be able to show what it can achieve. The biggest advantage for shipping and aviation, in one way, is having been excluded from Kyoto in '97 from the land-based targets. So these two global industries can show what they can achieve, and society can then help those industries achieve those targets and encourage the energy sector to help that transition, for example, take place.
Thank you very much, Michael, for giving us the insight. Also, Catherine, I want to go to you about it as well. The biggest difficulty is the uncertainty. And how could you plan with the uncertainties and all uncertainties? That's probably one of the biggest tasks facing all of us. Could you take it from there about our grand goal and the current realities?
I think we have to try to create certainty. I don't think we can, have a Darwinian process of working out which technology wins. We don't have time. So we have to start really making and shaping the future. But what, I would like to say is that, when we're looking at the coordination challenge that's been talked about, what we've got is a series of technology transitions that we're trying to make happen in a very rapid amount of time. And we need governments to take action, but we need them to take action in a very specific way, depending on where the technology transition is. So for the early phase of technology transition, governments can create niche markets where technologies can get underway. And we saw that with the early stages of EVs. But at a later stage of a technology transition, you might need to take action to diffuse technology, to try to get it, mass adopted. And you can think about what happened with when we got rid of CFCs out of fridges, what kind of action was taken there. And I guess I would just put a note of caution that, a UN, sort of every nation approach to this is going to really get the right result. I'm a diplomat by background, and every good diplomat knows that a good negotiation is when you've got maximum leverage in the fewest numbers of players. So if you think about what that means for energy transition, how do we leverage, what are our leverage points in the transition? For airports, it might be that there are 10 countries in the world that have the biggest airport hubs. How do we leverage that to force the transition once you've got the costs down on a particular technology? Which governments really need to come together to make the transition happen?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Great questions. I'm sure great questions usually lead to great answers later after the great thoughts. So let me go to you, Asa, too, about similar questions, uncertainties, but need to have plan and particularly implementation.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think that in this time where we are right now, and of course we've been talking a lot about that together within our sector, together along the value chain, but also with policymakers, how then to really take this chance and really recover better, and how to decide where should the investments be made now to restart societies in a greener and better way. And of course, as Catherine is saying, to really focus on the measure where it makes the most difference. And I think really, as both Dick and Michael were into, I think the most important partnership for us in industry is with policy. And we really need to work a lot closer and in a lot bigger confidence and trust, and really share information and facts and base our decisions on that. And of course, where we stand right now, and we've been all talking about targets, and I think if we all agree on the targets, it's much easier than to set this way out together with the policymakers how to get there. But then we have to share in a very trustful dialogue the road there, how to get there, what can we do, and how can policy support this, because we cannot deal with this alone. And I think we all agree industry is an important, very important vehicle in the transition, and we have a lot to offer. Scania is part of the leadership group for industry transition that is also co-hosting this seminar today. And we joined that at the UN Global Climate Summit in September last year. And as was also mentioned here, I think actually the UN processes and everything we can build around that with countries and governments and industry is very important, because then we can create these larger movements and find that leverage that Catherine is talking about. And really, when we can agree together with industry and policy, that's when it will happen, departing from the targets. And that's also why I think WEF is doing an excellent job in bringing all these parties together to be able to have this dialogue. And I think that's where we'll find the key in this transition.
We are feeling that. We are running very short on our time, but we want to squeeze in as many questions as possible. So let's go to some of the questions raised by our participants. We have articulative questions. This one, what role do you see for behavioral and lifestyle changes when it comes to green mobility? From every one of you, briefly, can we say 30 seconds? And Dick, you want to set a great example, 30 seconds.
I think everybody has a role to play. We have to take conscious decisions. In the end, individuals and their behavior are not going to take care of the whole transition. We need structural policy, technology, investment for that, but people do play a role, including in compensating, including in making conscious choices about what you do and how you behave.
And Catherine?
I would hope for it, but I think this crisis is so serious that we shouldn't rely on it. People do not pay their taxes because they're asked to.
Yeah. Michael?
I'm more optimistic. I believe that we have what we're seeing through how we're dealing with COVID shows the power of technology and the power of data, and I think adapting that to some of our maturer industries with much clearer leadership. And it will be the millennial generation that settles it. And in many parts of the world, some form of democracy works. If there's no democracy, the internet works to express opinions. And I think the younger generation in our society wants this to happen, and that is why I think it will happen. So I'm an old cynic sometimes, but I actually am a believer that this challenge is so big that our youth around the world really want to make those choices and genuinely make choices we chose not to make in our generation.
Yeah, I mean, they are there to make the choices, and also various generations, including ours, are here really to also implement it one by one, one step by another step, I guess. And Asa, also for you, the same question.
Yeah, no, I think there is a truth in both the more negative and the positive side. And I think our responsibility as industry and companies is really to put the products out there that are available and sustainable, that can be chosen, because I think there is a big power in the choice, and that especially the younger generation wants to take those decisions, but then it's our responsibility to make sure that it's possible and easy, and together with policy, again, affordable.
Yeah. Great point, great point. Another thing we have found among the questions, a lot of them are asking, let me find this. Any thoughts about how collaboration could be done? What's your changed expectations of leaders, corporate and political? And this is quite a general question. I guess it's coming in a way with policies and also with policymakers. Should we approach it that way? Dick? Also 30 seconds. By the way, you set a great example in the earlier round.
Thank you. It's first about ourselves and us acting. And for example, if you talk about aviation fuels, we are now building and contributing to, with KLM, Sky Energy, Shell, the first dedicated biokerosene facility in the Netherlands. At the same time, we do a pilot on the next one on synthetic in Rotterdam. So that's for us to do. And I think Asa got it right in terms of the type of engagement with politicians as well. There's a combination of sometimes reluctance in business and too much simplicity in politics, and the combination of the two does not get the problem resolved.
Asa, since your name is already mentioned.
No, yeah, but I think the most important thing in a successful partnership is knowing what the end goal is, what you want to achieve. And if you share that vision, then you can more easily start deciding a roadmap how to get there. So a shared vision, like we have, for example, in this partnership that I mentioned as an example, the Pathways Coalition along the value chain is a if you don't have that, then it's difficult to start together. But I think at some level, we all share that end goal in net zero 2050 at the latest vision. So I think there are great potential for many great partnerships leading there. But every partnership has its challenges, and it's always it's easy in the beginning, but then you get a lot of things to challenges to solve along the way.
Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, it's collaboration. It's absolutely essential. We as an energy company, we cannot move unless others move. So, you know, we're really grateful to the kind of key customers that we work with in trying to kind of, as Asa says, find that pathway. You have to align on the pathway, and then you really have to focus and work together, both on the actions you can take, but on trying to influence the external environment to support, you know, the transition.
Michael, I give you the final note. Michael?
Nothing happens overnight, but we're seeing through collaboration lots of parallel initiatives happening. In the maritime sector, the Getting to Zero Coalition and other initiatives of the Global Maritime Forum are doing things ship owners would never have dreamed of 5 years ago in terms of working together and accepting those challenges. As the major capital providers to the shipping industry, we've set up the Poseidon principles, the major shipping banks, to encourage the shipping ship owners to essentially invest in efficient, low carbon and ultimately zero carbon vessels. So it's lots of little things happen that feed off each other. And, you know, we can't change the politics of the world, but we've seen in what Shell and BP, for example, have already done in recognizing the transition in their businesses. We've already begun to see individual leaders show that initiative and set the example that all of us can do.
Every step counts. Every action certainly could be as an inspiring example for all of us. And I want to thank the four of you for joining us and sharing your insights with such an efficient way. Dick Benschop, Asa Pettersson, and Michael Parker, last but certainly not least, Catherine Dixon. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I learned a lot. I'm sure our participants also learned a lot. And by the way, talking about the participants, we want you to help us to do these things. You are welcome to give your feedback. You can see that from the Slido page. And also you can go to the post. Also you can connect, share your experiences, interact with other participants on top link. And we have a next session coming up, materials for transition, building toward at a speed and scale. That's coming up later. We hope you are going to participate. Once again, I want to thank our panelists, thank Christoph, who opened the panel for us, and also our organizer. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of all our colleagues, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.